A routine traffic stop, or so it seems until a veteran judge dressed in a tuxedo is forced out of his car by a cop who refuses to believe a black man can hold that kind of power. What she doesn't know is that she's just laid hands on the wrong man, a man who spent his entire life fighting injustice from behind the bench. What follows is a quiet war of ego, race, and accountability, where every word, every silence, and every camera angle matters. This isn't just about one night, it's about a system on trial and a judge who refuses to be silenced. So grab your coffee, settle in, and tell us what time are you watching and where are you tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. On a crisp autumn evening in rural Georgia, the kind where the air smells faintly of pine and the light fades in slow golden waves, Judge Vernon Calhoun stood alone at the edge of a banquet hall, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. Behind him, laughter still echoed from the grand ballroom, mingling with the soft clink of glasses and the rustling of silk gowns. But he had heard enough of ceremony and applause for one night. He tugged gently at his tuxedo collar, exhaling the kind of tired breath that doesn't come from physical exhaustion, but from years of carrying the weight of being the first, the only, and too often the exception in rooms where decisions were made by men who still saw his presence as symbolic rather than earned. Outside, the cool wind whispered through tall oak trees, and the sound of cicadas rose like a low, restless choir in the distance. He paused at the top of the stone steps, letting the night air settle over his skin, grounding himself in the silence after the noise. Moments like this, small and ordinary to most, were precious to Vernon. These were the quiet pockets where he didn't have to wear the robe, carry the fight, or prepare for the next challenge before the last had even ended. Yet even as he watched the valet approach, with his black Lincoln gliding smooth under the porch light, a tension he couldn't quite name crept across his shoulders. The young white attendant hesitated, eyes flicking between Vernon and the car keys in his hand, then asked with a voice tight with discomfort, "Sir, you sure this is yours?" Vernon met the boy's gaze without flinching, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Yes," he said calmly, reaching into his pocket and handing over the valet ticket, "I'm sure." The boy nodded, flushed, and turned away, walking a little too quickly toward the vehicle. Vernon didn't say anything more, didn't raise his voice, didn't show the sting behind that question. He'd heard it 100 times in 100 different forms. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Is this really yours? Do you belong here?" It wasn't hatred that left those cuts. It was something colder, quieter, the doubt that always came first and never quite went away. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced up at the dimming sky, and reminded himself, "You earned everything they think you don't deserve." When the car rolled to a stop and the door was opened for him, Vernon slid into the driver's seat with a slow, deliberate grace. He adjusted the mirror, checked the seat, and took one last look at the grand building behind him. The banners, the speeches, the well-meaning praise, it all seemed distant, now fading into the rear view before he even turned the key. The engine purred to life beneath his feet, but the hum was quickly swallowed by a deeper silence, the kind that often settles over southern roads after dark. He pulled onto the main street, the tires crunching gently over gravel, the dashboard casting a soft glow across his face. The streets were nearly empty, and for a moment he let himself enjoy the stillness, the slow rhythm of headlights sweeping across lonely trees, the muted thud of a distant train somewhere deep in the woods. But peace was a fragile thing in Vernon's world, and it never lasted long without interruption. At the third intersection, just as he was about to turn toward the highway that would carry him back to his quiet home on the edge of town, he noticed a pair of headlights in the rearview mirror, a patrol car tailing him too closely to be accidental. He made the turn anyway, smooth and legal, not breaking speed, not drifting over the line. The cruiser followed, his grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles whitening just slightly. He knew this pattern, had lived it more times than he cared to count. The sudden, unexplained attention, the slow, circling suspicion, the way protocol turned to provocation, often without warning. He kept his eyes forward, driving exactly the speed limit, signaling every move as if the law itself were watching from the sky. But inside, a storm was beginning to churn. Not of fear, no, that had long since been trained into something colder, but of weary calculation. How will this go? Who is behind me? What's her name? What's her history? What's she trying to prove? His phone buzzed once in the cup holder. He didn't check it. Distraction wasn't an option now. A red light ahead gave him time to glance into the rearview mirror. That's when he saw her, a white woman, blonde, sharp-featured, sitting stiff in the squad car, with a posture that didn't look routine. He could tell from the way she leaned forward, from the tightness in her mouth, that she wasn't just patrolling. She had found a target. His jaw set. His heart stayed steady, but his breath deepened, slow and practiced. A kind of preparation that came not from panic but from experience. She doesn't know who I am, he thought. But she already knows what she thinks I am. The light turned green. He drove forward. The cruiser stayed close, then closer, until the blue and red lights finally erupted in a sudden burst of color across the night. Vernon pulled to the side, calmly, blinkers on hands at 10 and 2, just like every father and uncle and elder had taught every black boy since long before he was born. He didn't move, didn't speak. He waited because waiting was survival. In the side mirror, he saw the door open. Boots hit pavement. The crunch of gravel was heavy and intentional. Then a voice, sharp, unyielding. "Step out of the vehicle." He turned his head slowly, his voice measured and even. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" No answer. Just another order, this time more forceful. "Now." He looked down at his hands. They were steady. Everything in him wanted to ask again, to assert his rights, to remind her who she was talking to. But none of that mattered right now. Not here. Not with no one else around. He opened the door, the weight of it groaning slightly in the silence, and stepped out into the night air. The wind had picked up a little. The trees rustled behind him. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and went quiet again. As he stood beside the car, his hands relaxed at his sides, he felt the shift, the moment when dignity met danger, and neither one was guaranteed to come out whole. He didn't speak again. He waited for her to do what she came to do. And in that moment, with the sound of leaves skittering across asphalt and the faint hum of his engine still running behind him, Judge Vernon Calhoun stood not as a symbol, not as a story, not even as a judge, but as a man under the gaze of someone who already decided he was a suspect. And he knew, as clearly as he knew his own name, that what happened next could change everything or nothing at all. She stood there in the dark, one hand on her holster, the other clenched into a tight fist at her side. The red and blue lights from the cruiser painting her face in flashes of suspicion and barely hidden contempt. Officer Rachel Brandt didn't blink as she stepped closer to Vernon, boots scraping against the rough asphalt, her voice cutting through the cold night air like a knife when she said, "Out of the car." Now. Vernon's breath caught for the briefest moment, not in fear but in calculation, because in that second the rules of civility were no longer in effect. He had not raised his voice, had not challenged her authority, had not offered anything but calm dignity, but she had already decided what role he would play in her narrative. The door creaked open under his hand, heavy with the weight of the moment, and as he stepped out, the night seemed to hold its breath with him. The gravel under his dress shoes crunched louder than it should have. The faint breeze carried the smell of pine and engine oil, and somewhere beyond the trees a whippoorwill called out into the dark, as if trying to warn him. He moved slowly, deliberately, hands, visible posture, straight, his tuxedo jacket rustling softly as he turned toward her, standing tall, unarmed, exposed. "Officer," he said again, his voice low and firm, "you haven't told me why I've been pulled over." She didn't answer him. She only motioned sharply toward the hood of his car, her face stiff, unreadable, as if she were holding something back and not doing a great job of it. "Turn around," she snapped, already stepping into his personal space, hands on the car. The tone wasn't one of caution or protocol. It was control, raw and personal. The kind used by people who want to remind you they can take something from you just because they can. Vernon hesitated, not out of defiance, but because he had to weigh the next 10 seconds like a man defusing a bomb. In this moment, he was no longer a judge, no longer a respected figure of law, no longer the man who had defended families, marched with veterans, buried a wife, and raised 2 daughters. He was in her eyes, just another threat in the shadows. He turned, slowly, deliberately, hands flat against the cool metal of the Lincoln's hood, the cold seeping through his fingertips like a warning he'd known was coming all his life. The slap of the handcuffs broke the silence like a gunshot. Her grip was too tight, her movements rough and impatient, and the metallic snap echoed off the trees like a mockery of justice. "You're making a mistake," he said, barely above a whisper, not because he was unsure, but because he didn't want to give her any excuse to make it worse. "You don't want to do this." She didn't respond, at least not in words. Instead, she yanked his wrists higher behind his back, forcing his shoulders forward in a display of power that had nothing to do with safety or threat. "I'll be the judge of that," she said, smirking at her own pun as if the irony pleased her. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, feeling the heat rise in his chest, not from fear, but from a deep, bitter anger, the kind that simmers beneath decades of restraint. The kind he had learned to bury so deeply, it had become almost silent. Almost. The roadside scene was lit like a twisted stage headlights, glaring emergency lights, spinning the hum of the engine still low and steady behind him, as if unaware of what was unfolding in its glow. Rachel reached for her radio, the static crackling before she calmly declared, "Possible stolen vehicle suspect in custody." Vernon turned his head slightly, voice calm, even deliberate. "That's a lie. This is my car and you know it." She didn't even flinch. "Yeah, well," she said, tapping her notepad with theatrical indifference, "let's just see what the system says." Just as she began to tug him backward toward the cruiser parked behind them, the sound of tires crunching gravel sliced through the stillness. A second vehicle rolled to a slow stop nearby, a dusty sedan with its headlights off and engine still running. The door opened slowly, then a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the glowing screen of a phone held in one trembling hand. "Hey," the voice rang out young and sharp, more disbelief than fear. "I got all of it on video." Rachel froze for a half-second, a ripple of something irritation alarm flashing across her face. Vernon turned his head just enough to see the young black man standing on the side of the road, holding up his phone like it was a shield. His voice cracked, but it carried. "This is wrong. You're arresting a judge for no reason." Rachel turned sharply, her jaw-locked eyes narrow. "Put the phone down. Turn that off." But the young man didn't budge. Or what he said, not yelling, just standing his ground like a tree in the wind, trembling but rooted. "You gonna arrest me for filming, for telling the truth?" Vernon watched the tension tighten around her frame, saw the war behind her eyes, the one between pride and consequence, between her need to assert dominance and her sudden awareness that the world might be watching. He could feel her restraint beginning to crack. She was used to acting without witnesses, but now the story was no longer hers to control. And just like that, something shifted, not in her, not yet, but in Vernon. The pressure on his wrists, the humiliation of the moment, the weight of decades of near misses and buried rage, it all crystallized into a single steady thought: "You're not alone this time." The boy with the phone was scared, yes, but he stood firm, not because he had power, but because he knew what it meant when power went unchecked. Rachel didn't say another word. She backed off slowly, her expression unreadable but her fists clenched tight white at the knuckles. Vernon remained still, breathing slow, and measured the cuffs biting into his wrists, the metal cruel and cold. He knew this would be far from over, but in that moment, with the lights flashing behind him and a witness refusing to be silent, the darkness no longer felt impenetrable. And when he finally looked up toward the trees lining the roadside, he didn't feel defeated or afraid, just resolved, because now someone else had seen it. And in the quiet between sirens and shouting, that truth was beginning to take root. Inside the dimly lit sheriff's office, the radio on the corner desk crackled to life, with a burst of static breaking the uneasy stillness of the room. Sheriff Wyatt Darnell was halfway through his evening coffee, its bitter warmth clinging to the inside of his mouth, when he heard the dispatcher's voice, calm and routine at first, but followed by a statement that made his stomach clench. "Unit 27 reporting a possible stolen vehicle. Subject detained. Name given: Vernon Calhoun." The sheriff didn't move right away. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and hard to breathe. He set the coffee down slowly, eyes fixed on the wall, not because he was shocked to hear the name, but because deep down he already knew something had gone wrong. He reached for the radio with hands that moved slower than they should have, the weight of familiarity settling over his shoulders like a heavy coat he didn't want to wear anymore. "Repeat that dispatch," he said, though he didn't need to. He had heard it right. Vernon Calhoun, judge, decorated veteran. A man whose reputation stretched far beyond this small town's borders, but more importantly, a man he had grown up with on different sides of a line that had been drawn long before either of them had picked up a badge or a gavel. The dispatcher confirmed the call, her voice clipped and professional, but there was something else beneath it, something she wasn't saying out loud, because everyone in that office knew who Judge Calhoun was, and none of them could explain why a traffic stop had turned into a detainment, especially not one involving Officer Rachel Brandt. Darnell stood up, his spine stiff from years of carrying burdens that had long outlived their usefulness, and grabbed his keys from the hook beside the door. The station's overhead lights buzzed softly. As he passed under them, the silence in the room suddenly louder than the noise. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the dry leaves along the sidewalk, and carrying with it the smell of damp asphalt and pine. The sheriff's cruiser started with a low growl headlights cutting a clean path through the creeping dark as he turned onto the main road and headed toward the scene. He didn't turn on his sirens, there was no need for spectacle, but his foot pressed harder on the gas with every passing mile, and the lines on his face deepened with each thought that ran through his head. Rachel's too quick with that gun, too eager to prove something. Vernon's the wrong man to put in cuffs, hell, the wrong man to mistake for anyone else. He knew how bad this would look, but more than that, he knew how wrong it already was. And the closer he got to the blinking red and blue lights ahead, the more he felt the knot of shame and dread tightening in his chest, not because he had made the mistake, but because someone under his command had, and it wasn't the first time. When he pulled up to the scene, the cruiser's lights washed over the figures in front of him like a cruel spotlight on a play that no one wanted to watch. There was Rachel standing with her arms crossed, her face set in that stubborn scowl she wore whenever she felt challenged. And there, bent slightly at the waist, cuffed and silent, was Vernon Calhoun, dignified, even in restraint, still as a statue, his eyes locked on a point in the distance like he was holding back the flood. Darnell stepped out of the car, boots landing heavily on the ground, the sound sharp against the quiet. Rachel turned when she saw him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, quickly masked by that same rigid authority. "Sheriff," she said, like she hadn't just detained one of the most respected men in the county. Suspect was acting suspicious. Gave me attitude, refused to comply. The sheriff didn't answer her right away. Instead, he walked slowly toward Vernon, taking in the scene, not just the cuffs, not just the tension in the air, but the young man on the side of the road, still filming, his phone raised like a witness with nowhere else to go. Darnell looked at Vernon, then at the cuffs, and then back again. "Jesus, Rachel," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear, "do you even know who this man is?" Her jaw tensed and her eyes narrowed in response. "He said he was a judge," she replied, defensive now, but still unyielding. "Didn't show ID right away. I followed procedure." Darnell took a deep breath, the kind you take when you know there's no version of this that ends cleanly. "Procedure doesn't include humiliating a federal judge in the middle of the damn road," he said louder, this time, voice flat but laced with a fury he didn't bother hiding. "Take those cuffs off, now." Rachel hesitated, her hands twitching at her sides, torn between command and defiance. But there was no mistaking the weight of the moment now, not with the sheriff staring her down, not with that camera still recording, not with Vernon standing silent waiting for the dignity he'd earned to be returned. Slowly, stiffly, she stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs, the click of the metal releasing louder than it should have been. Vernon didn't move right away. He simply exhaled, then reached back to adjust the sleeve of his tuxedo, the gesture small but deliberate, like a man reclaiming his place piece by piece. Darnell turned to him then, eyes softer than before, regret already forming in the lines around his mouth. "Vernon," he began, but the judge held up a hand, not to silence him, but to signal that nothing said right now could fix what had already been broken. He looked past the sheriff, past Rachel, past the boy with the phone, and then spoke in a voice so calm it chilled the air. "I want her badge on my desk by morning," he said simply, "or I want a damn good explanation." No one answered him. Not right away, because there was nothing left to say. The damage had been done, the lines had been crossed. And the weight of that truth settled over them all, like dust, thick and choking, impossible to ignore. As Vernon turned and walked back toward his car, straightening his back with each step, the night seemed quieter than before, but not at peace. It was the kind of silence that lingers after something sacred has been violated, the kind that waits for justice to answer. There are moments in a man's life when the past doesn't just catch up with him, it folds itself neatly into the present and sits beside him like an old, unwelcome friend. For Judge Vernon Calhoun, that moment came not on the side of a highway, not in front of flashing lights or drawn weapons, but in the silence of his study just hours after being released from handcuffs. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a gift from his late wife Evelyn, who used to say time should never be wasted, especially not on regret. But tonight that ticking sound wasn't comforting. It was accusing, relentless, reminding him of every second he'd spent convincing the world he belonged, only to be reminded in an instant that some people would never see past the skin. He poured himself a drink, the amber bourbon catching the light like fire in a storm, and sank into the leather armchair that had molded itself to his shape over the years. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't check the news. He just sat, one hand wrapped around the glass, the other pressed to his temple as if holding in the ache that was beginning to build behind his eyes. His mind drifted not forward but backward across decades of memory, paved with lessons that had cost more than they gave. He was 14 the first time a police officer pulled a gun on him. It was 1968, the summer his cousin was killed in a traffic stop, just 3 counties over, and Vernon had skipped the church picnic to ride his bike to the library in a white neighborhood. He remembered the officer's voice tight, like a trap snapping shut, shouting at him to get off the bike, to show his hands to stop pretending. He hadn't known then what he was pretending to be. Only later did he realize the officer meant pretending to be innocent, pretending to be educated, pretending to belong. That day never left him, not even after law school, not even after federal appointments, not even after Evelyn pinned the judge's badge on his chest and whispered, "You made it, baby. You changed the ending." Because the truth was, the ending never really changed. It just got quieter, more insidious, better dressed. He didn't become a judge to feel powerful. He became one to feel safe. And even now, even at the pinnacle of a career carved out with blood and grit and grace, that safety could still be stripped away with a careless assumption and a set of steel cuffs. The glass trembled slightly in his hand, not from anger, not from fear, but from the sharpness of memory, sharp like the sound of Evelyn's laughter echoing in the kitchen, sharp like the letter she'd left behind before cancer claimed her too, young, reminding him to keep choosing courage over comfort. "Never forget who you are," she had written, but more importantly, never forget who they'll try to tell you you're not. In another part of town, far from the soft lamplight of Vernon's study, Officer Rachel Brandt sat on the edge of her unmade bed, the glow of her phone screen casting long shadows on the walls. She scrolled through local news headlines, each one more damning than the last, each mention of Judge Vernon Calhoun tightening the knot in her chest. The images in her head refused to fade: his calm face, the weight of his silence, the sharp shift in the air when the sheriff arrived and said her name like it was already in the past tense. She wasn't new to complaints. There had been murmurs before minor disciplinary actions, a few reports buried deep enough to disappear under the right signatures, but none had ever made it to the surface like this. She told herself over and over that she'd followed protocol. She told herself he was acting off, that his refusal to obey immediately was reason enough. But beneath those justifications was something colder, something she didn't say out loud even to herself. She hadn't cuffed him because he was uncooperative. She had cuffed him because the moment he spoke, the moment he named his title, she felt something she didn't want to name, something like being challenged, like being small. Her father had always said, "Don't let anyone make you feel like less just because they have more education or wear a suit." And she'd taken that to heart, maybe too literally. He was the kind of man who believed the world was changing too fast and leaving good people behind. She'd grown up with his warnings in her ears and his prejudices in her hands disguised as tradition and toughness. And now, sitting in the dark, her badge on the nightstand beside a half-empty bottle of beer, Rachel couldn't quite tell where his voice ended and hers began. Vernon, meanwhile, stood up slowly from his chair, bourbon untouched, and walked to the window. The yard outside was quiet, the old oak tree casting shadows across the porch where Evelyn used to sit with a book and a glass of sweet tea. He watched the wind tug gently at the hanging fern. She planted its leaves trembling in the night air, and he felt the weight of every battle he'd fought, not on paper, but in spaces like this, in glances, in questions, in disbelief, dressed up as politeness. He wasn't surprised by what had happened, not really. But he was tired in a way that rest couldn't fix, tired of holding back, of staying composed so others wouldn't feel confronted by his truth. And yet he knew he couldn't stop. He knew that silence would cost more than speaking ever had, not just for him but for every young man who looked like him, who hadn't yet made it to the bench or the bar or the boardroom. He thought of the boy who filmed everything, of the fear in his voice, but also the steel in it. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, headlights sweeping across the living room wall like ghosts of some future still unwritten. Vernon let the curtain fall gently back into place, his hand lingering for a moment, fingers pressed against the glass like a promise. He wouldn't sleep tonight, not because he couldn't, but because something had shifted, something he couldn't name yet, but could feel in his bones. And in that stillness, beneath the hum of the night and the weight of memory, he made a quiet decision, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of something deeper, a sense of responsibility, a sense of purpose. a refusal to let this moment pass without meaning. Then he turned off the light, walked down the hallway, and closed the study door behind him, leaving the past where it belonged, but not forgotten, never forgotten. The morning light crept in slowly through the lace curtains of Vernon Calhoun's kitchen, filtering through in warm slants that bathed the walls in a quiet golden glow. The coffee maker gurgled and steamed in the background, its familiar rhythm, a grounding sound in a world that had turned sideways overnight. Vernon stood by the window, one hand wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the other resting on the sill fingers, tapping a slow, unconscious beat against the wood. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life, as it always did, cars backing out of driveways, dogs barking behind chain-link fences, and children darting down sidewalks with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. But something in the air felt different today, heavier, more alert. He had barely slept. The events of the previous night hadn't settled into memory yet. They clung to his skin like humidity in August, persistent, cloying, and impossible to ignore. The cold bite of the cuffs still lingered on his wrists, like a phantom pressure, a silent reminder that no matter how high he climbed, some people would always see him through a cracked lens. But it wasn't the humiliation that kept him up, it was the silence after. The silence of choices he hadn't made, of words he hadn't said, of a storm that hadn't yet broken. The phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, vibrating with the urgency of the modern world, and Vernon picked it up without thinking. A string of missed calls, text messages, and unread emails stared back at him. Reporters, colleagues, even a few old friends he hadn't heard from in years. But it was one name that stopped him cold: Mason Dupree, the young man who had recorded everything, who had stood on the sidewalk with shaking hands and unwavering purpose. Vernon opened the message. It was short. No greeting, no explanation. Just a link and the words, "You need to see this." With a slow exhale, he clicked. The video opened on the frozen image of flashing lights and a figure in a tuxedo standing stiff against the hood of a black Lincoln. Vernon pressed play, and there he was himself, but from the outside, from the angle of someone witnessing someone, capturing the truth without interruption. Rachel Brandt's voice cut through the audio like sandpaper, sharp, demanding, dripping with authority that had no place in that moment. He watched his own calm unravel under her aggression, watched the way she gripped his arms with unnecessary force, watched the slow realization settle over her face when the sheriff arrived, and everything shifted. Then came the boy's voice, nervous, tremulous at first, but growing steadier with every word. "This is wrong. You're arresting a judge for no reason." And somehow hearing himself be named, not as a suspect, not as a threat, but as what he was made, the ache behind Vernon's ribs deepen into something sharper. Not grief, not even rage, but clarity. He didn't watch it twice. He didn't have to. The truth was out now, and there was no stuffing it back into silence. He closed the phone, set it on the table, and sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath him as if acknowledging the weight of what he was about to carry. Outside, the world was still moving, still unaware that something seismic had shifted in this quiet corner of Georgia. But inside, Vernon Calhoun was changing. By noon, the video had spread like fire in dry brush. It leapt from phones to inboxes, from local news segments to national platforms. Anchors raised their eyebrows and asked rhetorical questions into the camera. Social media feeds churned with hashtags and heated commentary, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about the man in the tuxedo and the woman with the badge. Some called it a misunderstanding, others saw it for what it was. But none could unsee the moment it all went wrong. At the courthouse, whispers filled the hallways before Vernon even arrived. Staffers paused, mid-step voices dropped to cautious murmurs, and eyes followed the door like they were waiting for a reckoning to walk through it. When he did, shoulders square, tie, perfectly knotted briefcase in hand, the silence was immediate. He didn't look for sympathy. He didn't expect applause. He only gave a small nod to the receptionist, the same young man who'd once asked if he needed help finding a lawyer, and headed toward his chambers. It was there that the knock came, soft, respectful, but urgent. "Judge Calhoun," the voice said, muffled through the thick oak. "You have a visitor." He opened the door to find Chief Justice David Holloway standing there, tall and broad, with lines in his brow that hadn't been there last week. The two men had shared many conversations over the years, some public, others behind closed doors, but never under circumstances like this. Holloway didn't smile. He simply stepped inside and held out a hand. "I saw the video," he said. "Unacceptable doesn't even begin to cover it." Vernon nodded, closing the door behind him. "I thought I left that part of my life behind." "No," Holloway replied, his tone dry but sincere. "You just learned it's been walking 2 steps behind you this whole time." They sat in the quiet that only seasoned professionals know how to inhabit, not awkward, not empty, but filled with the weight of decisions yet to be made. The Chief Justice leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "The department's already feeling the heat. Brandt's being called in for review. Internal Affairs is on it. But I want your voice in this. You're not just the victim here, you're the standard. They need to see what accountability looks like in real time." Vernon didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, the ones that had held gavels and briefs, but had also held the hands of grieving mothers and shaking teenagers who didn't trust the system he represented. And now he had to decide whether to step into the fire or let others pretend it was only smoke. "I'll be there," he said, finally, voice steady. "Not for me. For what comes next?" That evening, the courthouse emptied in waves as the sun dipped behind the magnolia trees, casting long shadows across the marble steps. Vernon lingered at his window, watching the day give way to dusk, the sky fading from gold to gray in slow, silent surrender. His face, lit only by the fading light, held no anger and no regret, only a quiet resolve sharpened by truth. He reached for the blinds, then paused, letting the last rays of daylight stretch across his desk. And in that stillness, where dignity met determination, he understood exactly what had to be done. By the following day, the town no longer whispered, it buzzed. The story had spilled out of phone screens and front pages, past the edges of the courthouse, and into barbershops, grocery stores, diners, and porches, spreading like a fire that refused to be contained. In the black churches, the elders didn't speak it as gossip, but as confirmation, their voices low and heavy, with the kind of sorrow that doesn't sound surprised, only tired. Meanwhile, in the affluent neighborhoods with flag-lined lawns and motion-triggered porch lights, the video was watched behind closed doors, followed by words like unfortunate, confusing, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Judge Vernon Calhoun noticed the shift not just in headlines but in the weight of people's stares, some emboldened, others ashamed. When he walked through the downtown square that afternoon to pick up lunch from the same cafe he'd visited every Friday for the last 6 years, the young woman at the counter didn't make eye contact. Her voice caught slightly when she asked, "The usual judge," as if saying his title out loud might set off some alarm. Outside, a teenager with dyed green braids and a phone in his back pocket gave Vernon a subtle nod, not out of recognition but respect. It was quiet, unspoken, but real. As he sat on a bench near the fountain and unwrapped his sandwich, the sounds of the town moved around him like a current, a lawnmower starting in the distance, church bells marking the hour, a mother calling her child's name from across the street. And beneath all of that, there was something else, a tension that couldn't be named, but was felt in every small hesitation, every longer-than-usual pause in conversation. The town wasn't the same, not because something new had been revealed, but because something old had been caught on tape. The silence had been broken, and no one quite knew what to do with the noise that followed. Later that evening, Vernon returned home to find Reverend Isaiah Boone waiting for him on the front porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a worn Bible resting on his knee and a thermos of sweet tea beside him. Boone didn't get up when Vernon approached. He simply tilted his head and said, "You look like a man carrying 10 pounds more than his shoulders were made for." Vernon offered a tired smile, eased down into the chair beside him, and let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding all day. They didn't speak for a while, just rocked gently in rhythm with the creaking wood beneath them, the sounds of cicadas humming in the trees, and the occasional rustle of wind nudging the porch swing against the railing. Finally, Boone said, "They're watching you now. Not just the ones who want to see you fall, but the ones who need to see you stand." Vernon didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the darkening sky, where a single star had begun to flicker into view, and let that truth settle in. "I didn't ask for this spotlight," he said quietly, his voice low, "and even I just wanted to do my job and go home in peace." Boone chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that comes from age and too many hard lessons. "Ain't none of us ever asked for it," he said, "but that don't mean we can let it go to waste." Vernon thought about Mason Dupree, the boy with the phone who had stood his ground on that sidewalk. He'd received a message from him earlier that day, nothing long, just a short note that said, "Let me know if you want help organizing. People are listening." Vernon hadn't replied yet. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because the weight of that word organizing felt like more than just logistics. It meant stepping out from behind the bench, taking off the robe, and becoming something the system didn't always allow judges to be: visible, vulnerable, human. Boone reached for his thermos and took a long sip before speaking again. "People think courage looks like shouting or marching," he said. "But sometimes it's just telling the truth out loud in a room full of people who'd rather you didn't." Vernon turned to look at his old friend, saw the lines etched deep into his face, the wisdom behind tired eyes, and understood that this wasn't about his pride or his position. It was about what he would do now, that the mask had slipped and the whole town had seen what lay beneath it. That night, Vernon didn't sleep right away. He stood for a long time at the back window, watching the moonlight cast silver shadows across the yard, where Evelyn used to plant her roses. He remembered how she used to hum while she worked, always off-key but full of joy, and how she once told him, "The hardest thing about being the first is that you don't get to be invisible even when you want to be." He smiled faintly at the memory, then stepped back from the window and turned off the light. Before heading to bed, he opened his laptop, typed out a short statement, and sent it to the local paper. In it, he didn't call for resignation or revenge. He called for review, for transparency, for accountability. He called for training that meant something, for leadership that didn't flinch when the spotlight turned inward, and for a community to stop pretending that silence ever meant peace. When he finally lay down, the night was still, the kind of quiet that comes not from everything being calm, but from everything having been named. Vernon closed his eyes, not because the storm was over, but because now at least he wasn't weathering it alone. The air inside the review chamber was still and unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel like a disruption. The blinds were drawn just enough to let slivers of daylight cut across the polished table, dividing the space into sharp contrasts of light and shadow. Vernon Calhoun sat at the far end of the room, not in his judge's robe this time, but in a tailored navy suit that somehow carried even more authority, the crease in his trousers, as deliberate as the weight in his gaze. Across from him sat Officer Rachel Brant Shoulders, stiff face unreadable, her police badge notably absent from her uniform. She didn't look at him, not once. Not when he entered, not when he sat, not even when the clerk announced that the hearing was in session. Her eyes were fixed on the table jaw, clenched fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. The room held 6 people in total: Vernon, Rachel, the police commissioner, 2 internal affairs officers, and a silent legal observer, with a tablet balanced on his knee, recording every gesture, every word, every breath, like it might be evidence. Someday, the commissioner cleared his throat, a sound more habitual than necessary, and began to read from a prepared statement that neither calmed nor inflamed the room. It simply filled time, like the slow ticking of a distant clock. As he spoke, Vernon didn't move. He listened with the stillness of someone who had spent years letting others talk first, someone who knew the power of quiet, who understood that sometimes silence wasn't surrender, it was precision. When the video played, projected on a small monitor mounted to the wall, the room seemed to shrink around it. The footage was raw and unpolished, the handheld recording trembling slightly with the adrenaline of the boy behind the camera, but every second was undeniable. There was Rachel, stepping from her cruiser with authority sharpened to a blade, barking commands at a man in a tuxedo who never once raised his voice or lowered his hands. There was the forceful shove, the snap of metal, the tightening of cuffs that didn't need to be tightened, and there was the stillness in Vernon's face, the kind that comes not from calm, but from endurance. The officers didn't flinch as the recording played, but something in the air shifted, an imperceptible tilt of posture. A glance exchanged, a pen gripped tighter than before. Rachel stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a flat line, her chest rising and falling slowly, as though controlling her breathing was the last thing she had power over. When the video ended, the room didn't speak right away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, intentional. The commissioner leaned forward, his elbows creaking against the old oak table. "Officer Brant," he said, his voice low but firm, "you've been accused of misconduct, excessive use of force, and racial profiling. You've seen the footage. You've heard the complaint. Do you have anything to say?" Rachel's mouth twitched slightly, and for the first time she looked up, not at Vernon but at the commissioner. "I followed protocol," she said, her voice steady but hollow. "He didn't comply immediately. He was evasive. He acted suspicious. The words hung there dry and familiar, as if pulled from the handbook of every excuse that had ever been used to justify harm without consequence. Vernon didn't react, didn't roll his eyes or shake his head. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the table, the gesture calm but commanding. With all due respect, he began, his voice smooth, as aged oak is the bar for suspicious, now set so low that driving home from a charity event qualifies. Is standing still and asking a question now considered evasive? Rachel's eyes flicked to his just for a second, then back down again. Her mouth didn't move. The commissioner shifted in his seat. Judge Calhoun, your testimony is on record, but if you have any further comments, this would be the time. Vernon nodded slowly, then took a breath deep enough to anchor himself. What happened that night was not the first time I've been treated as if my presence were a provocation. But what made this different, what made it dangerous, was that she knew who I was and still chose power over procedure. This wasn't fear. This was certainty. The certainty that she could do it and that no one would stop her. The words landed hard, not with dramatic flair, but with the weight of accumulated experience. He wasn't angry in that moment. He was measured, restrained, as always, but his restraint was no longer a shield. It was a choice. One of the internal affairs officers scribbled something on a pad, then looked up. "Officer Brandt, did you recognize Judge Calhoun during the stop?" Rachel hesitated, her throat moving as she swallowed, then replied, "Eventually. And did you alter your behavior after that recognition?" She didn't answer immediately, but the pause said more than any confession might have. "No," she admitted. "I didn't." The room held its breath. The commissioner sat back, his expression unreadable but his tone resolute. "Given the evidence, the public nature of the incident, and the violation of department policy, you are hereby placed on unpaid suspension pending further investigation. A formal statement will be released by the department. You are to surrender your badge and firearm immediately." Rachel stiffened, her body rigid with disbelief, but she didn't argue, she didn't cry, she didn't protest. She just sat there, jaw clenched, the consequences catching up with her faster than her pride could run. Vernon didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply exhaled and lowered his gaze, not in relief but in reflection. Because this moment, this accountability wasn't victory. It was only the start of a reckoning long overdue. After the room emptied, Vernon stepped outside, blinking against the sudden brightness of the late afternoon sun. The courthouse steps felt taller than usual, the weight of the hearing still sitting across his shoulders like an invisible robe. He paused halfway down and looked out across the square where people moved about their business, some watching him from a distance, others pretending not to see. He adjusted his cufflink, the silver catching the sunlight, and for a moment he stood still, breathing in the warm breeze that rustled the flags above the courthouse doors. There was no applause, no justice parade. Just an old man in a suit standing in a place he'd fought to reach, knowing that the fight had merely shifted shape, not ended. As he reached the bottom step, a voice called softly from behind, "Judge Calhoun." He turned to see a young woman no older than 25, holding a notebook, her eyes wide and unsure. "I'm with the Tribune," she said. "Can I ask, how does it feel seeing an officer held accountable?" Vernon looked at her, then past her to the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and answered with a tone that held no bitterness, only truth, like pulling a single weed from a field that's been overgrown for decades. "It's a start, but only a start." And with that, he walked away, the sound of his footsteps blending into the rhythm of the day, his presence calm, composed, and unmistakably firm, like someone who had not been broken, only sharpened by the very pressure meant to silence him. The town didn't settle after the hearing. It held its breath in that strange space between reaction and reflection, unsure whether to exhale in relief or brace for backlash. Word of Officer Brandt's suspension spread faster than the official press release passed from porch to barbershop to Sunday school, like a shared secret wrapped in cautious hope. Some said it was overdue, others called it political, and a few insisted it was only temporary, that she'd be reinstated the moment things cooled down and folks stopped watching. But Vernon Calhoun knew better. He knew that this moment, as charged and visible as it was, couldn't be left to memory. It had to be transformed into policy, into purpose, into permanence. The morning after the decision, Vernon stood at the edge of his backyard, where dew still clung to the grass, and the breeze moved with the hush of early promise. He had no plans to return to the bench just yet. His docket had been reassigned temporarily, and though he knew he would eventually return, he also knew that the robe, no matter how symbolic, could no longer be the only way he served. His phone buzzed again, the third time that morning, and he glanced at it without picking it up. More requests for interviews, another invitation to speak on a panel, a message from a civil rights organization he hadn't worked with in years. He walked slowly toward the back fence, his fingertips grazing the tops of the tall grass. Evelyn had once insisted on leaving wild because she liked the way it danced when the wind got curious. He smiled at the thought, but the smile faded as he turned over Mason Dupree's last message in his mind, the one that had come just after the hearing, sent without preface, without pretense. We need to move while people are paying attention. We've got the footage. We've got momentum. What we don't have is your voice outside the courtroom. It was a simple truth, but it landed heavy, not because Vernon doubted it, but because deep down he had always feared it. Being visible had always come with a cost. Judges weren't supposed to campaign to call for reform from the streets, to speak in the same cadence as the people they ruled over. But Vernon had seen too much now, and been too close to the edge of something irreversible. The silence that had protected his career no longer felt like wisdom, it felt like complicity. That afternoon, he called a press conference. Not a grand affair, just a gathering outside the courthouse steps, the same steps he had descended so many times, with rulings held close to his chest. This time he wore no robe, no title pinned to his name, just a crisp shirt beneath the Georgia sun, and a message he no longer had the luxury of holding back. Reporters gathered first, then community leaders, then neighbors, and eventually strangers who had only ever known him from headlines or hashtag. Vernon stepped forward when the microphones were ready, cleared his throat, and spoke not as a judge but as a witness. What happened to me, he began, his voice even and low, is not unique, it's not rare, it's not even surprising. He let that sink in before continuing, but what made it different was that someone recorded it. What made it powerful was that someone else said, "This isn't right." And what makes it meaningful now is what we choose to do with it. He didn't point fingers. He didn't name enemies. Instead, he laid out a simple but firm list of demands: mandatory racial bias training for all local law enforcement officers, independent oversight on police conduct reviews, and a formal review of past complaints filed against Officer Brandt and others like her. He didn't frame it as retribution. He framed it as renewal. "We cannot heal a wound," he said, "by pretending it wasn't there in the first place." The applause wasn't thunderous, it was respectful, thoughtful. A few people stood with arms crossed, eyes skeptical, but Vernon didn't need them all to agree. He just needed the people with power to know that the silence had ended. Later that night, he sat alone in his study, the day's momentum behind him, the future suddenly wide open, in ways he hadn't expected. He thought about what Evelyn would have said, how she might have teased him for finally giving a speech without hiding behind a bench. He thought about his daughters, both of whom had called within minutes of the press conference, proud, but concerned, their voices full of love and measured caution. And he thought about Mason, the young man with the phone, the steady hands, and the quiet bravery that had changed everything. There was a knock at the door just after 10. Vernon wasn't expecting anyone, but when he opened it, Mason stood there, hands in his jacket, pockets, posture, half defiant, half unsure. Vernon stepped aside without a word, and the two sat in the living room where the walls held photographs of a life that had spanned injustice and progress in equal measure. "I didn't want to text," Mason said, finally breaking the silence. "I figured this needed to be face-to-face." Vernon nodded. "You were right to push me. I needed the nudge." Mason's shoulders relaxed a little. "I didn't do it for that," he said quietly. "I just didn't want this to be another story people forget by next week." Vernon studied him, seeing not just youth but conviction, raw and urgent, the kind that refuses to wait its turn. "What do you want to build?" he asked. "Not just protest. What do you want to last?" Mason looked down, then back up. "Something that doesn't need a video to matter." For a long moment neither spoke. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room filled the space between them, grounding the moment in something domestic, something real. Vernon leaned back in his chair, folded his hands across his chest, and let the thought settle. "That's the work," he said. "The laws don't move until the people behind them do, and the people won't move until they see someone stand." They didn't make promises that night. They didn't sketch out blueprints or draft legislation. But they did share something quieter, something more powerful than declarations, a shared understanding that the road forward was long, and neither of them would be walking it alone. As Mason left, Vernon watched the taillights disappear into the night, the sky overhead deep and starlit, the weight in his chest, lighter than it had been in days. He turned off the porch light, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him, not to shut out the world, but to prepare for it. In that quiet house, under the watchful eyes of memory and legacy, Vernon Calhoun made peace with something he had long tried to avoid, that justice wasn't a destination he could reach alone. It was a journey that required him to lead even when the path was still being carved from stone. The courthouse smelled of old wood floor polish, and something faintly metallic, maybe history, maybe memory, maybe the quiet residue of power used and misused over generations. Judge Vernon Calhoun moved through its hallways that morning with a calm stride, his gait steady, his posture upright, yet every step he took felt a degree heavier than the last. The echoes of his shoes rang through the marble corridors, a rhythmic reminder that the weight of justice once carried lightly now pressed deeper into his shoulders. This was not just another morning, and it was not just another docket. He knew that before he even unlocked the door to his courtroom. Outside, the town was waking slowly, same as it always had, coffee brewing in the corner, diner traffic thickening around the school buses and radios humming with yesterday's news. But inside this building, something had shifted. Eyes followed him longer. Staff paused just a second more. No one said anything direct, but their expressions carried questions. They didn't dare speak aloud about fairness, about change, about whether what had happened with Officer Brandt was truly over or merely paused. Vernon reached his bench, let his fingers trail the polished edge of the mahogany wood, and exhaled deeply before sitting. The courtroom was quiet, not because it was empty, but because everyone inside it seemed to sense that today's case had grown in significance overnight. It wasn't about a violent confrontation or a high-profile protest. It was about a 17-year-old boy named Elijah Turner who had been stopped, questioned, and charged with resisting arrest without ever committing a crime. Vernon had read the report twice, then a third time in silence, letting the language settle like dust on a wound that hadn't quite closed. The arresting officer's reasoning had been vague. The subject appeared evasive, failed to answer, promptly displayed erratic behavior. Vernon had seen those words before too many times. They had been used like a key to a hidden drawer, unlocking room for suspicion without evidence, force without accountability. Elijah had no record, no weapon, no threat. But he had a hoodie, a quiet demeanor, and dark skin, and sometimes that was enough. The bailiff called the court to order, and Vernon straightened slightly as the boy was led in. Elijah looked younger than his age, with wary eyes and a chin that refused to lift fully. His mother followed closely behind her hand, hovering near his back, not quite touching him, but there if he faltered. Vernon watched their body language carefully, the way Elijah sat stiff and uncertain, and the way his mother folded her hands in her lap like a prayer waiting to be answered. The prosecutor's voice droned through the opening remarks, polished and practiced, describing the officer's account of events with the dispassion of someone describing a technical malfunction. Elijah's public defender spoke in a quieter tone, his voice full of careful honesty, painting a picture, not of defiance but fear, a young man who didn't run but froze, who didn't yell but flinched, who didn't resist but failed to immediately obey a command, barked in a tone that had been sharpened by assumption. Vernon listened to all of it, but what held his attention most was not the attorney's. It was Elijah's face. The way the boy kept looking at the floor, blinking too often, his jaw tightening each time the word suspect was used. Vernon recognized that expression not of guilt but of someone being told again and again that they were a problem simply for existing. It reminded him of 100 boys he had seen pass through this courtroom over the years, and more than that, it reminded him of himself. The defense concluded, and for a long moment the room sat in a stillness, so complete it almost felt sacred. Vernon leaned forward slightly, folded his hands on the bench, and looked directly at the young man before him. "Elijah," he said, his tone, "even I need you to look at me." The boy raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting Vernon's with a hesitance that spoke volumes. Vernon didn't smile, didn't offer comfort where the law demanded formality, but his voice carried the weight of something deeper than authority. "You've been accused of resisting," he said, "but what I see is someone who's been taught to fear more than to trust. What I see is a system that still asks you to be twice as calm, twice as quiet, and 10 times as careful just to be seen as worthy of fairness." He paused, letting the words find their place in the room. "I'm not here to give lectures," he added, "but I won't pretend this is just about paperwork and precedent. It's about dignity. It's about pattern. And I'm not going to let a young man's future be sacrificed to protect an old excuse." He turned to the attorneys, his gaze unwavering. "Case dismissed. Record sealed. Elijah Turner is free to go." Gasps rippled softly through the gallery, and the prosecutor's mouth opened, then shut, defeated by the clarity of the moment. Elijah didn't move at first. His mother reached for his hand, and only then did he exhale, his chest sinking in relief that he hadn't let himself believe would come. Vernon watched them leave, the boy's shoulders still guarded, but his steps just a little more certain than when he had entered. After court recessed, Vernon remained seated at the bench alone now, the stained glass windows throwing bands of colored light across the floor. He stared down at the empty docket in front of him and felt something shift, not a sense of completion, but an understanding that his role had changed. It wasn't enough to interpret the law. He had to confront the forces shaping it from behind closed doors. He rose slowly, removed his robe, and folded it over the back of his chair, fingers lingering on the fabric for a moment longer than usual. There was no applause waiting for him outside, no cameras, no chants or rallies, just the quiet hum of a building full of ordinary people doing their jobs. But something in the air felt different, a little clearer, a little braver. As he stepped outside, the sun broke through a stretch of lingering cloud, warm and sudden on his face. Vernon lifted his hand to shade his eyes, and in that light, he didn't feel like a man stepping away from tradition. He felt like a man walking toward something still unfinished but worth fighting for. And that was enough. For now, the morning sky unfurled slowly over the courthouse steps, painting the pale stone in soft shades of gold and gray, as if the sun itself understood the weight of what this day meant and chose reverence over radiance. Judge Vernon Calhoun stood at the top of those steps, hands clasped in front of him, watching as the crowd gathered below with quiet steadiness in his gaze. There were no protest signs today, no chants echoing off the brick walls of downtown, no angry voices demanding change at the top of their lungs. What filled the air instead was something gentler, something rarer, a sense of purpose without panic, a kind of quiet that didn't signal surrender but resolve. The people who had come were not the loudest or the most visible, but they were the kind who understood that justice didn't end when the camera stopped rolling. There were teachers and deacons, shop owners and retired bus drivers, students with backpacks and elders with canes, and in the middle of them all stood Mason Dupree, his camera phone tucked away, this time his hands out of his pockets, his shoulders upright, not with defiance but with pride. He looked up at Vernon with a half-smile that said everything and nothing at once. Vernon nodded back just once and descended the steps with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had finally stopped asking permission to lead. They gathered in front of the new plaque, just a bronze square bolted into the old stone wall beside the courthouse entrance, but already worn at the edges by curious fingers and reverent touch. It read simply, "In honor of those who stood so others could stand free. No names, no politics, just truth." Vernon stood beside it, now his reflection faint in the polished metal, and for a brief moment he saw not just himself, but every man and woman who had come before him. Those who had marched when it was dangerous, spoken when it was costly, stayed seated when it would have been easier to stand. As the last few people settled into place, the mayor stepped forward with a folded sheet of paper in his hand and cleared his throat before speaking into the microphone. His words were well written and sincere enough, acknowledging the importance of unity, of progress, and of bridges being built in difficult times. But Vernon barely heard them, not out of disrespect, but because his mind was elsewhere, rooted in the stillness that comes when you finally understand that change is no longer a dream, but a choice. When it was his turn to speak, he approached the microphone slowly, letting the silence hold a few beats longer than necessary. Then he looked out over the faces in front of him, some familiar, some entirely new, and began not with a speech but with a story. "I was 10 years old the first time I walked past this courthouse and felt afraid of it," he said, his voice calm, carried by the morning breeze. "Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had already been taught that this building didn't belong to me. Not really." A murmur moved gently through the crowd, not of surprise but recognition. He continued, "My father never told me not to dream, but he told me to dream quietly, to work twice as hard, speak half as loud, and always keep my hands where people could see them. That kind of teaching doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from survival." He let the words settle, not filling the silence but giving it space to be heard. "But I also remember the first time I stood inside this building, not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as a judge. I remember Evelyn pressing my tie straight, whispering in my ear, 'Make them see more than what they expect.' I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, the system could bend enough to hold all of us." A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth at the mention of her name. The crowd held still listening. And now he said, "We're here, not because the work is finished, not because the hurt has healed, but because we finally decided that silence is not the same as peace. And I want to say this plainly, what happened to me on that road under those lights should never have happened. But it did. And now it cannot be undone. What we can do, what we must do, is make sure it matters." He stepped away from the mic, not with dramatic flair, but with quiet purpose. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was steady, respectful. A kind of shared heartbeat more than a celebration. After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed into clumps of conversation and long-held hugs, Vernon stood with Mason near the edge of the courtyard beneath a wide oak tree that had probably stood longer than the courthouse itself. The younger man looked up at the leaves, their edges lit by sun and wind, then glanced back at Vernon. "So, what happens now, Judge?" He asked, the question simple but heavy with implication. Vernon didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then back toward the building where he had spent most of his adult life, weighing the lives of others in words, rulings, and precedent. Then he turned his eyes to Mason and said with a voice quiet but unshakable, "Now, we keep going." Mason gave a half nod, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't ask for more details. He didn't need them. Some truths don't require maps, they only need movement. As the afternoon wore on, Vernon walked home alone, the streets quiet, except for the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a dog behind a fence. The weight he carried was still there, but it sat differently now, not like a burden, but like a duty. Not just to speak, but to listen. Not just to fight, but to build. He reached his front porch just as the light began to soften, and he paused at the steps, one hand on the rail, eyes scanning the neighborhood that had watched him grow older but never smaller. Somewhere a wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and cut grass. He sat on the porch swing and leaned back slowly, letting it creak beneath him, his legs stretched out, his breath slow and steady. The house behind him was quiet, but the silence felt earned this time. Not the silence of retreat, but of readiness. Inside, the phone would probably ring again. Emails would wait. Headlines would write themselves. But for this moment, there was just the sky, the tree, and the steady rhythm of a swing carrying a man who had not been defeated but refined. He looked up, eyes narrowing against the late-day sun, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's not over. It's only the beginning." And then for the first time in a long while, Vernon Calhoun closed his eyes, not to shut the world out, but to hold it closer. There are moments in life that go beyond a personal story. They become powerful reminders of justice, dignity, and quiet perseverance. The story of Judge Vernon Calhoun isn't just about a man treated unfairly, it's proof that even when we reach the highest places, we are still not immune to prejudice. But instead of reacting with anger, he chose dialogue, chose action, and chose to stand so others could walk more firmly behind him. The greatest lesson doesn't lie in punishing the wrongdoer, but in transforming pain into progress. No matter our age, each of us still has the power to make an impact through our words, through our actions, or simply by refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. Because justice doesn't only come from those with the most power, it comes from those with the most courage. And sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to keep walking forward even when the road ahead is long and uncertain. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice helps keep the conversation going.